All right, hey everyone. This is a quicker lecture, I think. It's called the Rhetoric of Haiku, and we're going to use it to keep studying language in its smallest component. So it's sort of convenient that as we start transitioning from the rhetoric of sound into language, that we'll start with the smallest poetic type. So far you've learned about how words evolve over time, and we talked about how swear words have evolved over time, what that process looks like. It's called phonetic matching, essentially, and what it is that harsh and offensive sounds, in this particular case, should be matched with harsh and offensive content, because if you're trying to offend, why not match the offensive content with offensive sounds? That process takes forever, essentially forever. The words that we have at our disposal are the butt end of tens of thousands of years of word evolution. And what I want to use that as a basis for two reasons, because we're going to be talking about the phonetic matching in haiku, but I also want to talk to you about how haiku evolved over time. And I have a very strange thesis to start. It's a thesis so strange I think I have to tell you that I don't believe it, because part of me doesn't believe it. But the thesis is that haiku was discovered, not invented. Haiku, just make sure we're covering the basics here, the 575 syllable poem from Japan. Okay? How on earth could you describe a poem like haiku as being a discovery rather than an invention? Well, here's how it works. You wouldn't say that if you're playing guitar, that the guitar itself is an invention. That's true, but there's science involved here, and if you hit a certain, if you place your finger a certain distance on the fretboard very lightly, you hit what's called a harmonic. And it's this weird thing where there's a pitch change. If I were to have my finger very lightly on a chord, very lightly on a string, and I were to pluck very lightly, punk, 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 because I'm muting the chord, there's no sound. Punk, 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 punk. And if I slide my finger, punk, 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 punk. Now, without changing the amount that I'm dampening the chord, all of a sudden it'll go pong, like a doorknob. And if I move my finger more, punk, 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 punk. That's called a harmonic. And that was discovered. Now, the guitar was an invention, but the fact that scientifically there's a certain reverberation or a certain wavelength that's achieved at that particular magical spot on the string, that wasn't an invention. That was a discovery about the nature of physics and vibration. Hence, a harmonic is a discovery. Now, the ancient Japanese were very interested in venerating and revering nature. And they did so by experimenting with language. The assumption is that, the very firm assumption, we can be pretty sure, that poetry was invented as a media form at that point. But there were people doing short, contemplative poems, and they started tinkering with the syllable count. And we can be almost guaranteed that in these formative years, or decades, or millennia, or centuries, that we didn't start with the 575. That over time, people, as they were experimenting with this, and they were trying to create something that was revered and sounded mythical and beautiful and simple, as they were trying to do that, the poem form sort of pulsed like an organism around a syllable experiment. And more than likely what happened then was that as you got closer to 575, the enjoyment of the poem, or the purpose of the poem, was achieved to a greater extent. And at a certain point, we know this to be true through inference, at a certain point, someone did a 575 and they loved it. stop tinkering with it. Something happened. And we know this by inference. People noticed this and mimicked the 5-7-5 syllable structure. This has to be true. It's much more likely that this is true than that some super all-powerful poet master wrote the rules and forced everyone to follow a 5-7-5. That seems highly unlikely. Sure, there might have been someone who did it, like Matsubasho is a very famous Japanese haiku writer. And there are people like him who probably did a lot of the heavy lifting, but I argue that the haiku evolved over time until it hit a harmonic, until it hit something. What was that something? Well, instead of being a matter of physics and vibrations like a harmonic, the haiku resonates with something inside the human spirit. There's something in our soul, our psyche, our personality, our id, whatever synonym you want to use, that all of a sudden harmonizes with this particular style. And something happens, and if you tinker with it, it breaks. Just like with the harmonic, bunk, 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 bunk. If you hit that harmonic, bong, don't tinker with it or it collapses. And so that's my argument for why haiku was a discovery. And I think that in the humanities, with a lot of things, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but a lot of the media forms are essentially a process of evolution and tinkering by the best and brightest minds over a long period of time. Okay, now what is it that the Japanese were trying to do at a more complex level? Well, it's not very common that the Eastern and Western hemispheres completely agree on something because they have different lenses by which they view the world. But both the East and West hemisphere have come to the conclusion over millennia that there is a symbolic value to the seasons, meaning spring, summer, fall, winter. Another way of saying that is if you take what we know about the seasons, which is not mankind, and we anthropomorphize it, meaning we project our humanity onto the seasons, that mashup or that synthesis creates a new meaning. Let me say it a different way because this is complicated. It appears as though if you take nature and season and you take your mental model of what humans are and project onto that, there seems to be a similarity with nature and man. I guess instead of 5 fingers, I'll just go ahead and use 4 for the seasons. There's a lot in common with youth and childhood and early teen years. There's a lot in common with that era of humanity and spring. Spring is an era of rejuvenation, of young buds, of blossoming things, of vibrant energy, and uncontrollable sexuality. You see hints of that in the Western Hemisphere, both in pagan culture and in Christian culture. What do we have for Easter? It's a paganized version of Christianity with a rabbit is among the most fertile animals that we can think of very quickly. So eggs and rabbits became symbols of this phenomenon. Also, Christian baptism is this idea of being immersed in water and being brought forth in a rebirth. And water is also a very common symbol for spring. Water is used as a symbol in rebirth in poetry and movies and novels unbelievably often. There's a similarity between adulthood and summer. In summer, you have stasis and maintenance, and the heat causes a little bit of lethargy and plateau. No, not lethargy, I take that back. A plateau in growth. It's sort of a maintenance, and that's adulthood, where you sort of plateau and fall into your rut. There's a harmony between fall and being older, where things slow down, the energy decreases. There's an increasing amount of calm and tranquility and nostalgia. And then there's a harmony between winter and death. Calm, utterly calm, devoid of life. Cold, but yet peaceful. Paradoxically, death and peaceful. There's some harmony there too. So this is what the ancient Japanese writers were trying to revere and worship. It was almost their form of prayer, their Eastern form of prayer, because they were more pantheistic, I believe, and they worshipped nature as nature itself was more what God was. God was nature. Rather than the West, we think of God as being anthropomorphized again, which means having a personality of sorts. So anyway, haiku was a prayer, and that's why they took it so seriously. Now, because we've been talking about phonetic matching, I've already touched on the harsh, cacophonous sounds that have glottal stops and fricatives and plosives, and how those match more with aggression, stoicism, firmness, confidence, and how there's euphonous sounds with more open, airy, vowel-heavy sounds. Let's touch on the latter part now, that there are light, airy, simple sounds, and those pair very well with the haiku of winter. And so what I'm going to ask you to do in class at some point is I'm going to have you experiment with creating haiku about winter using euphonous or euphony, euphonous sounds. And I believe that doing so, you too will hear this harmonic. Whether or not you have experience with poetry, I think that when you write a haiku that is peaceful in temperament about winter using euphony, I think that you too will sense the mythical harmonic in that process. So I think that that's pretty valuable. In the future, I'm going to create a YouTube clip called the Rhetoric of Villanelle, and that's a completely different beast with a different personality, different evolution, different phonetic matching we'll use for that. So that's coming up next. I have a couple slides I want to show you real fast, just to make sure I didn't miss anything, and then I'll wrap it up here pretty soon. This slide is pretty much just acknowledging the fact that the Japanese are geared towards the tradition, and so they not only revere nature, they revere age and expertise. And so I believe that haiku was a discovery in Japan that could only have come from Japan. So when I typically will talk about in this slide about how this makes us sound terrible in the West, but McDonald's is only a flower that could bloom in the Western Hemisphere. Think about how McDonald's runs completely counter to the tradition, the honor of tradition and age and experience. McDonald's just doesn't flower in that potting soil. Likewise, Bushido blades, sushi, the honor of the elderly, and haiku. Those are flowers that could only bloom in the potting soil of the East, in my experience, or in my opinion, rather. I want to show you 3 adequate haiku first. The reason I'm showing you adequate haiku is just because I'm going to use their adequacy as a way of showing you a better version. The first one here, I'm going to read it in this sort of solemn seriousness that it deserves. Splashes of life here. Reanimation begins. The water comes forth. That's very springish in its DNA. Under gnarled trees, grandfather starts his story as blossoms fall down. In summer one day, when the sun shone very bright, his eyes were golden. All right, these will serve as, like I said, adequate haiku, and I want to point out some reasons why they're not the greatest haiku of all time. First, look at the second one. It's aesthetically very pleasing, and it takes advantage of the harmonic that haiku have. But it is not true to the tradition of haiku because there shouldn't be any humans in a haiku. If haiku were a form of prayer to worship nature and God, humans, this may be a Western perspective projected on the East, so I might have an expert tell me otherwise, but putting humans in a haiku drags the poem down, because I don't believe in the East they think of mankind as being equal to God in this natural environment, but that we should strive towards being more like nature. I think that's more closely akin to the Confucianism and Taoism that I've read about. So putting humans in is pulling this. Reverence means to like sort of lift up and to praise, and humans pull it back down. So if you're trying for advanced haiku, avoid human involvement. And that also is a problem with the second one. His eyes were golden. That is a human involvement. And the other thing that advanced haiku tend to do is they don't explicitly mention the season that they're describing. That's cheating. You should be able to describe your season symbolically and with enough visual imagery that we know exactly what's in the DNA of that poem. Seasonally, meaning. Now, this is a master haiku from Matsu Basho, and if you're ever looking up poems, a haiku, ancient haiku, on the computer, be very aware that translating poems out of Japanese or any language into another can mess up the syllable structure. This one manages to be 575, which, listen, translation butchers poetry. It really does. The translator has a fingerprint on this poem. So Matsu Basho was the undisputed, he was one of the greatest haiku writers in Japanese history. Translating, unfortunately, gives the translator a huge, heavy hand in the meaning of a poem, and so the translator's fingerprints all over this. However, it still manages to be glorious. Okay, here it is. Freezing solitude. In a world of one color, a great rush of wind. There's something about the simplicity and declarative nature of a haiku that just really make it feel profound. Okay? And even though this is a translator, it still is phonetically matched in a world of one color that is primarily euphonous sounds. The k in color is harsh. A great rush of wind. A great rush of wind. I wish I had some poetry here to show you where it was cacophonous, but howl again. Who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness. Supernatural darkness. All that stuff is harsh. And this avoids all of those hard-sounding cacophonous sounds. So this is phonetically matched. It's symbolically valuable. It resonates. I'm going to ask that you try 3 haiku on your own with all of these things in mind. It's way too much to juggle at the same time. Some of us will not be successful in this, at least not at first. So in case you want it all in one place, I won't read this to you because that would waste time. But this is a summary of everything we've talked about, and I'll step out here so you can pause it and look at it if you want to at a future time. And I leave you with a terrible haiku. This is from Beavis and Butthead, which was sort of like the what was that like? Like the South Park of the 90s. That was cool, huh? When we killed that frog, huh? It won't croak again. But actually, I like this haiku because it's the person who created this had to know all of the very deep symbols and references and tradition, had to know all of that in order to break them this successfully. It's about nature, it's about seasons, but it completely perverts it and adds just random, irreverent, guttural, I don't know. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.